all for joining us this evening. And it's my pleasure in just a moment to introduce our panelists, our content experts to help walk us through the story of the Tea Party. But I just want to underscore what Gina said. This program is launching our organization's effort to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Tea Party. And our view is that the questions that were born in Old South Meeting House, where the meetings of the body of the people took place, are still alive in the world today and still sit at the center of our democracy, right? How is my voice heard? Who speaks for me? What's my recourse when my voice is silenced or overlooked? And so I think our job here as we move through this commemorative year is to help people make connections between the past and the present, and to participate with us in making meaning from that past and helping them to have it speak in a very genuine way, authentic way to their experiences. But we need to understand the history in order to do that work. And so we're so grateful to have 4 fabulous historians with us today to help walk us through the story. So let me introduce them. Joseph Ellis, Professor Joseph Ellis, is one of the nation's leading scholars of American history. He is the author of 11 books. Ellis was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Founding Brothers, the Revolutionary Generation, and won the National Book Award for American Sphinx, a biography of Thomas Jefferson. We are honored to have you, Professor Ellis. Professor Benjamin Karp focuses particularly on urban politics, society, and culture in 18th century America. His books include Defiance of the Patriots, The Boston Tea Party, and The Making of America, which won the Triennial Society of the Cincinnati Cox Book Prize in 2013. Rebels Rising, Cities and the American Revolution, and his newest book, which is coming out in just a matter of days, The Great New York Fire of 1776, A Lost Story of the American Revolution. Thank you for being here tonight, Ben.
Thank you.
Professor Sarah Purcell is the L.F. Parker Professor of History at Grinnell College and previously taught at Central Michigan University. She is the author of Sealed with Blood, War, Sacrifice, and Memory in Revolutionary America, and Eyewitness History, the Early American Republic, and her newest book, Spectacle of Grief, Public Funerals and Memory in the Civil War Era. Sarah, we're thrilled to have you.
Thanks.
And John Bell, is a Massachusetts writer who specializes in, among other things, the start of the American Revolution in and around Boston. He maintains the very popular and widely read Boston 1775 blog, offering daily helpings of history, analysis, and unabashed gossip about revolutionary New England. And I can tell you the majority of our staff are daily followers of that blog and get a lot of really helpful information and good gossip from it. John is also the author of The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War. John, we're so grateful that you can join us this evening. So thank you, all of you, for being part of our panel. And as Gina said at the outset, we're going to cover a wide range of topics tonight, but all of it centered on the story of the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor on the night of December 16th, 1773. We want to understand how we got to that point, what was the context. We want to understand what were the events that led to that outbreak of violence against property that took place on that evening. We want to understand why that event was so pivotal in bringing about the crisis in empire that culminated with American independence. And I think we also want to understand the longer legacy of the event and how we understand it today, and what some of the repercussions are that we might consider as we commemorate this important anniversary throughout the coming year. So let me start by setting the stage. Before I was in this role, I was the chief historian and curator at the Old State House. And one of the things I used to ponder and ask our visitors to consider was, what would have happened if you had been able to stand just under the balcony of the Old State House in 1763? So this was just following the end of the long imperial conflict between Britain and France, It culminated with a 9-year war that, for reasons we need not explore, was known as the 7 Years' War, and in the colonies was known as the French and Indian War. And it marked the end of a long period of conflict between Britain and France, and a lot of violence that had been visited on the people of Massachusetts. If you'd gone out into the street and asked somebody how they felt about being a British subject, what kind of comment might you have gotten? Would people have spoken to a sense of pride and optimism for the future, or were there tensions? Was there anger that was the residue of the war? So I wonder, maybe Joseph, if you could get us started by giving us your view. I think it would be great to understand how you might think that question would be answered.
If I was standing there, my reaction would have been joy and exultation, because the size of the British triumph in 1763 was enormous. I mean, Great Britain became an empire by acquiring all the land in North America, from the Mississippi to the Atlantic and from Canada to Florida. And so my joy, if I had a crystal ball, there would have been a shadow cast over it, because this is really the beginning of the trouble for the British Empire, as well as and for American colonists. Essentially, up until then, the British policy towards its American colonies was not to have a policy. What Edmund Burke called, what kind of neglect?
Salutary.
Right, and that the acquisition of the territory essentially forced Great Britain to think about how to govern its colonies in a way that led to a series of measures. First, an attempt to restrict migration across the Alleghenies in 1763, and then the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and then attempt to restrict other forms of economic exchange, and the Townshend Acts. And these are the things that are like nails in the coffin, or things that were going to lead towards the outbreak of hostilities and lead towards our subject tonight, the Tea Party. But the interesting thing is that it's all a consequence of an incredibly lopsided triumph. And that triumph is what leads to what will become the beginning of American resistance.
Thanks so much. Does anybody else have thoughts they'd like to share? What would it feel like if we stepped out and started talking with folks outside the old State House in 1763?
I mean, I always think that the perspective that's important after the end of the war is London's perspective, right? I always give my students the line from Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility, right? The British Empire is now massive. They've kicked the French off the continent, but now they have a responsibility to pay for this war and try and govern all of these newly conquered people. And those challenges prove to be just really big challenges for the British Empire. There's no way that they can maintain the kind of centralized control that they want without angering these many constituencies, whether it's the white colonists in North America, or Caribbean planters, or or the Irish, or the Quebecois, or the Bengali, right, or the Native Americans, or the Afro-Caribbeans, right? It's just this enormous empire where you have to cut different deals with different constituencies, and it's a very difficult job of governing that they now have to do.
I think there were tensions on the Boston side too. I totally agree with both of those. I think there was tremendous pride in many hearts in Boston, outside the State House, in being British and feeling a confidence in the British Constitution and British liberties and the protections of the British Empire. But I think the French and Indian War had also shown a lot of folks that perhaps there were more differences in being a provincial colonist than being in London, than maybe some of them were entirely comfortable with, even though many were recent immigrants, many, pardon me, many had forebears who had come to Massachusetts, explicitly to get away from England. Nonetheless, they they had experienced things as part of militia service in the French and Indian War. They had been looked down upon by British regulars, by British military commanders. They hadn't necessarily been seen to perform particularly well, even though they felt tremendous pride in their defense of the British Empire. And so I think there were a few cracks in maybe the British identity, even if there still was tremendous pride in the British political system among certainly the white colonists in Boston in 1763.
I'd like to add that one factor that came up is that immediately after the end of the war, there's often an economic recession. And that hit North America. And then in early 1865, there was a wave of bankruptcies, Boston in particular, which really primed our town to be extra worried about the Stamp Act came down the pike a few months later.
That's great. So a couple of you have begun to mention things that are in the air that are going to start to push toward change. And we do, from 1763 to 1773 is just 10 years, and an immense arc is traveled during that period, and we need to try to unpack what exactly is driving the change of heart or increasing the frictions that already existed within the imperial structure. The Stamp Act has been mentioned. There's another set of taxes, the Townshend Acts, that are passed in 1768. So the Stamp Act in 1765, the Townshend Acts in 1768. Help the audience understand what those pieces of legislation coming out of London constituted and how they were received in Boston. Ben, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I mean, London has a perfectly reasonable expectation here, which is we just fought a war on behalf of you American colonists. Why not pony up a little so that we don't have to tax our own landholders in order to pay down the debt? And so first they try with stamps on various forms of legal documents, newspapers, and that angers, some of the most vocal people in the colonies. And so nobody likes that. And so a year later they repeal it, but they're like, well, we still want to get revenue from the colonies. Well, let's pick some very limited goods. Most of them are not that important: lead, glass, paper, things like that. But the most important one for our purposes is that 1768 is when they first put the tax on tea. It's like 3 pennies a pound. And look, I mean, they taxed all sorts of, the tea that came into England too. And many English people just got around that by smuggling tea from various continental European companies. So, on some level, this might not have made a huge difference in terms of the price that Americans were now going to have to pay for their tea. Nevertheless, the principle was supposed to be in place that Americans were supposed to pay a little bit extra to the British Treasury every time they purchased tea for home consumption.
Does anybody else have anything to add? Joe?
Yeah, just that I agree completely with what has been said here, and that in the colonial response to these taxes, no taxation without representation, might persuade many of our listeners to conclude that the real issue was financial. And the truth is that the real issue is not financial. The real issue is control. It has to do with that once I admit that Parliament has a right to tax and legislate, I lose control of my own political identity. And I think that I trust my own local representatives, but I cannot trust people so far away. And it's that control issue that's going to be the thing that breaks the colonies from Great Britain, because even though Great Britain will say, we're not trying to enslave you, which is what they claim is happening. It's a plot to enslave us. That sounds somewhat crazy. And it also sounds crazy that we're going to end up going to war over tea. But the underlying issue is once we surrender to another body an ocean away, the control of our own fate, we are as helpless as the abject slaves that many of us, in fact, own. And that's the argument that has the prowess and the argument that people like Samuel Adams are going to play.
What do others think about? Oh, sorry, Sarah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, jump right in.
No, I was just going to say that Massachusetts, the colony of Massachusetts, had very, very strong chartered rights, a very strong royal charter, and had a long, long tradition of I would say even more self-governance than some of the other colonies, many of the other colonies, and it had maintained that for a longer period of time. And then once the sort of rising conflict over this series of taxes and the end of salutary neglect, as Joe mentioned earlier, started, that also becomes a flashpoint for the changing of exactly those rights that Joe is just talking about. So the thought that Massachusetts, that the governor, the council, the provincial representatives would have more control over taxation, more control over revenue, more control over things like juries and grand juries and even prosecutions and all sorts of different issues of self-governance, really. And so it's not just purely about taxation, but it's about the respecting of those chartered rights that the Crown and the British political system had recognized in Massachusetts. And then through the 1760s into the 1770s, the actual efforts on the part of imperial officials to curtail those and to try to have more centralized control. It goes by fits and starts, but it's really an attempt to control things in a real power way, including taxes, but well beyond the issue of just taxes.
Yeah,
So
it gives the colonists the opportunity to argue that they're the ones who are the conservatives, that they're the ones who are claiming their rights as British citizens that are being violated by Parliament and the British ministry. And there's some truth to that. And John Adams makes that case pretty strongly in 1765. But that, well, I'll shut up there.
So is it fair to say then, based on what you all have submitted here, that when we hear the phrase "no taxation without representation," Americans today tend to hear taxation, but what they ought to hear is representation?
I think that's right.
They ought to hear both because it was part of the bargain. And the phrase "taxation without representation" first appears in a British newspaper reporting on what the Earl of Camden, British official and lord, a peer, had said a few years earlier in Parliament. So it wasn't that Americans were coming up with this idea on their own. Joe said, this was their idea of what was fundamental about the British Constitution. One aspect of no taxation without representation. That the House of Commons chooses taxation for Britain, and therefore Massachusetts legislature should be choosing taxation for people for British citizens in Massachusetts.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've got a lot of concern in the air about what the political landscape of the empire is and what voice Bostonians are going to have in their own affairs. And in the fall of 1768, we have 4,000 soldiers in the King's Army arrive in Boston. Help us understand why they come, and then let's unpack a little bit what their presence in Boston, what the impact of their presence in Boston was. So what brings those soldiers here, and what is the intent?
Well, they come because of a little light rioting that took place in 1768 in response to the Townshend Acts. That a little light rioting had been part of the mix of how Bostonians and American general had resisted the Stamp Act, had resisted the Act, and the royal officials felt that was going too far. And this, Boston being part of the British Empire, the royal officials, the Royal Army had according to the law, every right to station troops in the town, and the people in the town did not like this. A shoemaker named Robert Twelve Hughes left a couple of memoirs in the 1830s. He was a Tea Party, and one of the things they asked him about was when did you start to get angry? And he couldn't remember getting angry about the Stamp Act. He couldn't remember getting angry about whether lead or painters' colors was taxed. He got angry because suddenly there were as many soldiers in town as there were adult men.
And you have to remember that per those tensions from the French and Indian War that I mentioned, and going back for hundreds of years, at least 100 years before this, British soldiers, regular soldiers from a standing army, were seen as really one of the apex tools of that threat of tyranny that Joe was referring to earlier. So if you had already some suspicions from these taxes that the British were going to crack down, the presence of well-armed, permanent, professional British soldiers in your city, and potentially being forced to be quartered in, maybe even in people's homes, but at least in public buildings in the city of Boston, they were seen as symbols of tyranny. They were seen that way in England as well, and in Ireland, and in Scotland, and many other places. And so they were definitely even if not being deployed against the populace, they were people who had, who could raise the tension just by their presence, because they represented the armed authority of the British government, and they were seen to be personally threatening to people.
That's great. So help us understand then what is the impact of the presence of these regular soldiers in the midst of the town, right? So thousands of regular soldiers in a town with a population of roughly 15,000, right? So it's not a small number of soldiers. And how does the town receive them? What happens to these tensions? And how does the town physically respond?
I mean, it's interesting. Serena Zabin's recent book on the Boston Massacre kind of argues that actually Bostonians and soldiers often got along. Soldiers were able to marry local women, they had children with them, etc. So, but at the same time, there were definitely Bostonians who were interested in keeping those tensions alive and ramping up the controversy. So, what you see are clashes eventually that culminate in the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770.
So Ben, you mentioned the massacre, and I think it's part of the story of the coming of the crisis in 1773. Can our panel help us to understand what is it that leads to the massacre, and help us understand a little bit about that event? But really, let's think about what is the legacy of that, and how will it hang over the town as we move towards 1773? Sarah, do you want to start?
I think Ben was going to. Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, my favorite little thing that I mentioned in my book on the Tea Party is that at least 4 participants in the Boston Tea Party had bullets go right by them 3 years earlier at the Boston Massacre. George Robert Twelves Hughes, who John mentioned before, right, catches one of the victims in his arms, and a few other men reported having been there. And then will later participate in the Boston Tea Party. So one wonders, right, if that moment of feeling the hard hand of tyranny was in the minds of these men when they board the ships in 1773 and dump the East India Company's tea.
I think it was really galvanizing for a lot of men like George Robert Twelves Hughes, who were younger, were artisans, were poor men, or men like Crispus Attucks, the mixed race man who was killed in the massacre. It was galvanizing for those men men and boys, really teenagers, who had sort of scuffled with some of the troops, or maybe even had some labor competition or other kinds of competitive behaviors before the massacre. And then also, once that happened, and once those bullets are flying, and once there is a politicized memory of the massacre, then there start to build these webs of connections between those men, between a more middling sort of political activists like Paul Revere, upper level craftspeople, and outright political leaders. Even though some of the political leaders, like the Adamses, had a hand in managing some of the conflicts after, for instance, defending soldiers, after the Boston Massacre, it nonetheless put into the milieu of Boston a politics of these different levels of society, not necessarily working together, but being aware of one another's political mobilizing and actions in the streets and actions in political clubs or in more politicized formally politicized spaces as having connections. And so I think it did that. It also prompted the British to move the soldiers really outside of the town eventually, and onto Castle Island, and that bottled them up in a way that's going to directly affect the destruction of the tea as well.
There is, sorry, Joe.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'll add to what has been said, which builds nicely to that one person in Boston named Samuel Adams is looking for a way to ignite a resistance movement against Great Britain. He is a real revolutionary, and the new book by Stacy Schiff is entitled that. And that the title Boston Massacre makes it sound much larger and worse than it was. And I think the way in which it's sold, if you will, and the way in which it's emphasized in the press and in the graphic description of it, is the first instance where a presence in the argument, this Samuel Adams guy, is going to influence the direction in which history moves. And that he really, whereas the bulk of American leaders at that time are not in favor of American independence and are counting on George III to rescue them from the mistakes of Parliament and the British ministry, he's on the other side. And why he is has to do with maybe his Puritan origins. Puritans don't like kings. They don't bow down to kings. Charles I bows in front of them and they cut his head off. He's a different kind of political animal, distinctive. And this is his season. He's a man for one season, but this is the season for Samuel Adams.
So Samuel Adams, obviously a central character in our story. So thank you for raising his name, Joe. And of course, the well-known portrait of Samuel Adams, painted by Copley, is meant to capture the moment on the day after the Boston Massacre when Adams argued with the then Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson over where those troops should be stationed and whether they should be removed from the town, as Sarah was speaking about before. So here are two antagonists, and I think they're common figures in our story, and their importance in the story is heightened by this period we've just been talking about that carries us from 1763 to the aftermath of the Boston Massacre. And I want, before we leave this sort of setting of the stage and turn our attention fully to the Tea Act and to the destruction of the tea, to just invite you to share other names. Who else has risen to prominence? Who else has been given a stake in the events? Who might have leaned in because of these conflicts in the 1760s, who will then come to play an important role in the discussion of the Tea Act?
Well, one figure who is important is William Mullen, and we hardly know that name now. But he was the man who he was a British-born merchant who had moved to Boston, pretty much a normal merchant in the 1750s, early 1760s, and then in the late 1760s, he really came to the fore as the leader of the Boston Whigs street protests, and he would lead marches against the people who weren't obeying the boycott. He would lead marches even against the governor's own home. He would lead the British troops when they left Boston, as Sarah said, to go to Castle Island, and he escorted them on his own because when he alongside them, they were safe from the crowd because he was the leader of the crowd. And he will be showing up at the Tea Party.
Great. So William Molyneux. Who else? If we are taking a poll, who should we be paying attention to here, Ben?
I mean, I think there are other elite figures like Josiah Quincy, Dr. Thomas Young, Dr. Joseph Warren, right? Everybody knows John Hancock and Samuel Adams, but there are other elite figures that are really important. But I think the other thing to remember is that there were middling and working class Bostonians who are also important to this story. A silversmith like Paul Revere, a bookseller like what's his name, Josiah Foster Condy, right? Like obscure names, right? A shoemaker like Ebenezer McIntosh or George Robert Twelves Hughes, right? They all had different methods for how they expressed their grievances with what Britain was doing. If you're upper class, you've got the legislature. You can petition people in England directly. If you're middle class, you might join an association that's meeting in a tavern and talking about what best to do. If you're working class, you might take your protests into the streets. And because we see all of those things happening in revolutionary Boston, I think it's really important to kind of see the whole social spectrum. And there were non-whites and women who were involved in Boston's protests as well, that we also really need to pay attention to. It's not just a top-down thing.
Another group of elite that need just to be mentioned, John Adams comes right in 1765, and Abigail Adams is in the mix, and Mercy Otis Warren, as well as James Otis, are really important players at this stage, and they start to become visible players in the ongoing conversation at that time. So people are called to the surface, and in some sense, the American Revolution, which nobody calls the American Revolution at that time, is creating a crisis in which people who would otherwise lead ordinary lives, and be at best, traveling salesmen, or lawyers, or what have you, are being brought to the surface. And the American founding in general is this long-standing critical moment, and the level of leadership that comes to the surface is forced to the surface. And ordinary people who would otherwise have led ordinary lives, Washington would have just been a normal squire in Virginia, suddenly become historically significant figures.
I'll just mention, all of those. Benjamin Franklin, who was representing Massachusetts and other states, other colonies in Parliament, to the Parliament in London, and he doesn't have a masterful control of all the reactions and the advocacy going on, but he becomes he continues to be a very important player and is connected to these events both afterwards. And I guess it's important, I mean, you said Thomas Hutchinson, but it's pretty remarkable that he had managed to maintain status and control as the governor, especially after his home was destroyed by mob action or pretty well destroyed by mob action after the Stamp Act, after he had been through a lot of vagaries and he had been sort of pushed between the forces in Massachusetts and the British imperial officials. And the destruction of the tea is really going to be his last big act. In fact, he was trying to get out of being governor and go on a kind of leave of absence, and he didn't get out of town quick enough for it to happen. And so he really he had been attacked before, and he was still there, and he's about to get attacked again. So and he had such a web of connections with his family, his sons, and the other merchants in Boston who were trying to import tea and who were interested in maintaining ties with Britain, because it's important to remember that not everybody was a revolutionary in Boston. And Hutchinson is a good example of that. He was also, American. He was born in Massachusetts and had a long lineage of prominent Massachusetts family, and he had a web of economic and family connections, many of which are quite shattered by the events in the 1770s.
The Bernard Bailyn biography, The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson, is one of the best things that Bailyn ever did. And he really is one of the first people to help us try to understand the loyalist mentality. The losers on the other side here are interesting people. And Hutchinson, who's up until then the greatest historian of Massachusetts, and descended from Hutchinson of the Rhode Island days. Anyway, read The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson and to get the other side of this story.
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion. And of course, Governor Hutchinson will play an important role in the affairs around the Tea Act in Boston. And I do want to turn our attention there. We've spent this much time setting the stage, in part because I think it's very hard to understand the crisis in December of 1773 if we can't recall just what a crazy run it has been, right? So that 10 years earlier, with the end of the 7 Years' War, some view to a new era of peace and prosperity for Boston, followed by the Stamp Act and riots and a new round of taxes and more protests and the arrival of soldiers and conflict in the streets and blood flowing in the streets and the town insisting the troops had to be removed, and they were removed, and there's a moment to catch one's breath. And then in 1773, Parliament passes the Tea Act. So remembering our phrase, no taxation without representation, we should hear representation. What's going on here? What is Parliament trying to achieve with this legislation, and how are the colonists perceiving it?
I mean, Carly Simon would say that the Americans are so vain and probably think the Tea Act is about them, and it really isn't. I mean, the Tea Act was passed for the benefit of the East India Company, which was this private chartered monopoly company that could do all the trading for the British Empire east of the Cape of Good Hope. And so, the East India Company was having significant financial and political problems. It's got mounds and mounds of tea in its warehouses that it can't sell, but the company was too big to fail. And so they get bailed out by Parliament, and Parliament says, well, one way we could help you is by making it as cheap as possible for you to dump some of your excess tea on the colonial American market. And the Americans will like it because it's actually going to make tea cheaper for the Americans. So this is all going to work out fine. Here's what you do, East India Company. You handpick a few families in each of the big cities, a few merchant firms in each of the big cities that will serve as the consignees, that will get these fat privileged contracts to be able to take the tea, and then they can resell it. And so this will basically knock out all of the other middlemen who in America who sold tea in the colonies. And so the Americans don't really like that. And because the Townsend duty on tea was still in place, the Americans didn't really like that either. And so even though the Tea Act, it really isn't about them, they see it as this kind of dual threat of both a monopoly being given power in the American colonies and also the continued attempt to raise revenue from American consumers. So this is the problem with the Tea Act, even though the Tea Act wasn't really supposed to be about the American colonies at all.
The other problem is that tea is just very popular and stylish and a highly desirable both trade good and part of domestic life. And it's been studied, you know, from fairly humble households, but definitely a big part of elite and polite society, women's sociability, but also men's sociability. And tea is very, very popular. And so there had been a non-importation movement, or what we might call now boycotts, you know, earlier as part of these efforts, but they had kind of petered out by the time of the Tea Act. And so there were still fits and starts, and some people like Samuel Adams who didn't want people to drink British tea. And Bostonians were definitely accustomed to drinking smuggled tea from other locations, as were Americans in many, many other cities. But actually, Bostonians, they stood to see the price of tea go down from the Tea Act because of the monopoly that would be granted to the East India Company, and it might even go down enough to rival the price of smuggled tea. But at the same time, the very fact that Parliament was giving a monopoly to the East India Company also further heightened those fears of tyranny that we were talking about before, because now it was not only changing the government of Massachusetts and tinkering with, you know, messing around with juries and things like that, but allowing private chartered companies to have monopolies, which would mess with livelihood, even aside from tax issues. So if you simultaneously try to get rid of smuggling, and you take control of juries and prosecutions, and you grant a chartered company a private monopoly, it's not just taxation that's the problem. It also is like undercutting both the political and economic confidence of people, and messing with what they like to do, which is sit around and drink tea and look fashionable with tea sets and tea tables. So it is a multifaceted attack. potentially.
The other thing is the Bostonians weren't even as good at smuggling as the New Yorkers and the Philadelphians. And the other Sons of Liberty were really angry at Boston because they smuggled some, but they continued to import legal tea after New York and Philadelphia had brought their legal imports of tea down to basically zero in the years leading up to the Boston Tea Party. So the New Yorkers and Philadelphia Sons of Liberty would write to Boston and be like, we don't actually trust you guys to keep up this boycott. We've been smuggling our hearts out here, and you Bostonians are drinking legal tea and paying the tax on it, and you're really punking out on this principle that we're all trying to stand strong on. And that's one of the reasons actually why the Boston Tea Party takes place in Boston and not in these other places. It's peer pressure from the Sons of Liberty in the middle colonies, who really thought that Boston wasn't quite holding up its end. I mean, Boston gets the reputation as being the most revolutionary, the most extreme, but actually the New Yorkers and Philadelphians were worried that the Bostonians weren't going far enough.
Although because Boston had that reputation of being extreme and violent, and where the massacre was and where the stamp protests started, the town brothers were very, very angry about being too violent, and that's so a pressure on them when it came to the. You don't actually want to say burn the ship. That would get rid of the tea, but that would make the town look really bad.
Okay, so here we are in November of 1773. Boston learns that 3 ships carrying the tea, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, are going to be arriving soon, and indeed they do in late November. And I take it that a sufficient response will not be just agreeing not to buy a cup of tea for yourself in order to avoid paying the tax, because there is a whole series of principles that are at stake here. So the town gathers to discuss how to respond. And those meetings take place at Old South Meeting House. They are not officially sanctioned town meetings, but rather call themselves the body of the people. Is that right? And help us understand, if that matters, what is the difference between the town meeting and the body of the people?
This is super important, right? I mean, the town meeting is the kind of properly constituted place where property holding people advance their votes, pass town ordinances, act through their selectmen. Everything's very formal and above board. The body of the people is not that. What the body of the people does for you is a few things. It allows you to invite people who aren't from Boston to come and sit in on your meeting. It allows you to invite non-property holders to also come in and pack the pews with people. So it really looks like it's this a kind of mass meeting and not just a kind of formal town thing. This gives them a certain popular legitimacy to kind of say this is the voice of the people expressing itself, right? These aren't just representatives of one town, doing their usual thing that they do every few months. This is the voice of the people. And there was a kind of tradition of that in the Anglo-American world that we're beyond the law and the courts now. Now we're really at the heart of popular protest. And the last thing I think that it does when you gather together the body of the people is now you've kind of freed the town of Boston from liability, right? Whatever the body of the people does, that wasn't the town of Boston. That was just this body of people, which wasn't even only Bostonians. And so it kind of diffuses responsibility. So if this body of the people actually does something unlawful, there's nothing that the courts can really say. They're not supposed to be able to punish the town because it wasn't the town acting. And this becomes really important after the tea is destroyed. The Bostonians can say, wasn't the town of Boston, don't hold us liable. It was the body of the people. They were just spontaneously gathering in this church, and there was nothing we could do. So it's an interesting diffusion of responsibility too.
But the meetings do have structure, right? And they do produce actions or resolutions. What happens in those first meetings? What is the outcome of those meetings? What is the idea for how to respond that emerges from that initial arc of conversation?
Well, one of the things the town decides on, or the people decide on, is that they patrol the docks to make sure that the people, the ships cannot be unloaded, the tea cannot be bought on shore, and therefore the tea tax collected. And the patrol set up like the militia. And in fact, they decide, instead of volunteers at every meeting, we will ask each militia captain to come up with a dozen or 20 men from their company to spend the night on the wharf, making sure nothing unloaded. it is also a militarized response that comes out of this meeting, but it's also a very organized response.
Joe.
Yeah, I just think that we need to point out to everybody that Boston's the only city in which the ships that bring the tea are forced to stay. In both Philadelphia and New York, the ships leave. They're sent away, and so the tea is not unloaded. Boston, because Governor Hutchinson is insisting on it, blocks the harbor. And so the real issue facing the people or the gathering in the church is, what do we do? Because we can't let this be landed and buy the tea, because in so doing, we're essentially going against our own commitment to not drink the tea, our embargo against British goods. So the question they're arguing about is what we do and how we respond to this. And I think I'll close by saying it's fairly clear from what's going to happen that Samuel Adams and members of the Sons of Liberty have met several times and have discussed what they will do if and when there can be no consensus, no kind of understanding, no decision about how to go forward in this larger meeting. And so what's about to transpire is a perfect Samuel Adams rigged operation. And I'd say that in a positive sense, that once it's clear that there is no other answer, there will be 40 militia disguised as Mohawk Indians standing right outside, and another 40, 50 yards down the way. Those are planted before this thing even starts. And so this is a conspiracy, an enlightened conspiracy.
Ben, do you agree with that, or?
I've never seen evidence that they were formally constituted as militia. I was making a face about that. You're muted. If you're welcome to respond to me, but you got to.
Well, they are not going to be recognized as militia. That's the reason they disguise themselves as Mohawks. They're marching in the same way that organized militia are. Most of them probably are militia. We can't be sure.
I mean, one way to say, like, I mean, every able-bodied man was supposed to be in the militia. So, I mean, you know.
And when they got the docks, they're part of the artillery company, put the docks in as a militia company, and they joined in.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, definitely there's an organized group of men who planned ahead of time to be there. But there's also some evidence of people having joined spontaneously at the moment too, and kind of hastily rubbing a disguise on, etc. So there's a kind of mix of plannedness and spontaneity that goes into the Tea Party.
But what makes me feature the plannedness is the extent to which they're under strict orders not to destroy anything or to fix all the locks after they've left. They want to make this look like a military operation instead of a mob. They're very committed to doing that. It's part of their act.
I mean, I've always seen that as a kind of expression of solidarity, right? We're all going to stand together and we're not going to make the town look bad. So again, I don't necessarily see it as something hierarchical and military. There's some evidence actually that that ordinary Bostonians, got together, decided they wanted to do something about the tea, and they actually asked like an upper class member of Boston, like, "Hey, could you organize us?" And he's like, "I can't really do anything, but if you go, you'll find friends," and that's the most that he can tell them.
I'm just saying, if this didn't have a quasi-military organization, you wouldn't have been able to control the people who are in the mob. They wouldn't have been able to behave as responsibly as they did, and that was part of the plan, to make this clear that this is not a mob, and it's a deliberative act. And so exactly what the makeup isn't as important, that they are functioning as something other than a raw mob.
Okay, so I think we have some uncertainty about how organized, but I think we can probably all agree that there were some in the room who had more information than others about what might happen that night on December 16th. Ben, you mentioned earlier the sort of body of the people frame allows for bringing a lot of people into the room and creating a sense of true mass. So there are reports that 5,000 people were in that meeting on the night of December 16th. Today, the capacity of Old South Meeting House is a little short of 600. And I often like to ask visitors before they know anything about how many might have stood there or how many were reported to have stood there, how many people do you think you could get in here? And nobody gets to 5,000. Do we really believe there were that many people there that night? John, you're probably more immersed in the details of the sources than anybody else here from that period. Is that feasible that we had that many people in the room?
Well, you're right that's what the sources say. Up to 5,000. Now it included, people packed in a standing room only. There were people outside the door listening in. We can, okay, maybe they were a little bit smaller. Maybe they had less worry about personal space. But that's always seemed a bit exaggerated to me. There are reports. There's a person named John Andrews, lovely, terrific, funny, lively descriptions of what happened in Boston, and all of his numbers have to be divided by 2.
But I think, well, sorry, Ben, you should answer.
I mean, it's possible that, people are just overcounting. I mean, people are just bad at estimating crowds. That's just always true. But on the other hand, I don't know. It's December in Boston. Who wouldn't want to snuggle up?
I just think it's also possible that it's porous. I mean, I think 5,000, maybe they weren't all exactly in the room simultaneously at the same moment, but I wouldn't be surprised if 5,000 people were there at some point, because lots of things were happening. The meetings were long. They convened, and then people went out and came back in, and they were sent. They actually, brought in, at least one of the merchants who was in charge of the tea, and they sent him out to communicate with Governor Hutchinson, and they were waiting for him to come back. And so, I think there are certainly more people in the crowd than, way more people in the meeting than went to march to the wharves, and even fewer who actually did the action against the tea, right? And so 5,000 is a way of saying a whole lot in 1773, but I think it's probably not impossible. And I think it's not impossible that on that day, 5,000 people might have been part of the meeting. Is certainly possible, because it was porous and lots of people were interested. And I actually, they didn't have like a fire inspector coming and kicking people out at 600 like you would today, right? If you suddenly had 3,000 people in Old South, it would draw law enforcement, and that wasn't what was going to happen. So I think it gave the opportunity. So it's a particular slice of the meeting. The people speaking are a particular slice. The people in charge of the meeting, whether no matter how important you think the leaders were, there certainly would be people in the lower stratus of society who could have been in and out of the room. Women might have been listening outside, maybe inside. They certainly weren't at the center giving speeches. Enslaved people were probably around. Like there's a whole spectrum of folks, and I don't know why we should completely disbelieve. Right, nobody took a head count, but it's a lot. It's a big crowd. It's the biggest building in Boston, right? So that's the other thing. They were initially going to hold one of these meetings in other places, and then they moved it to Old South because it was so big. So you just, when you hear 5,000, think the biggest meeting ever in Boston. That's what they meant, and they were probably right.
And think about if you're Francis Roach, right, the owner of the Dartmouth, and the guys at the front of the room are politely telling you, hey, could you turn your ship around and take it back to London with the tea still aboard? Okay, you're being asked politely, but you're being asked politely in this just packed house of people who really do not want to see that tea being landed.
Why doesn't he just say yes, Ben?
Well, he's afraid he'll be economically ruined, right? His ship will be liable to seizure by the British Navy if he turns his ship around with dutiable goods still aboard. That was totally illegal. And so unless he has some kind of special permission from Governor Hutchinson or from the customs officers or from somebody, he's really not going to want to lose his shirt for the sake of this political principle that everybody else is clamoring about.
Okay, so we've reached the moment here. We've got our huge meeting. There's some group inside who perhaps have a view to what's going to happen next when the meeting breaks up. A group does go down to the waterfront, and I want to ask a couple of questions briefly about the actual destruction of the tea. Joe mentioned costume, and I think that's an issue we should address head on, right? Many, not all of those who participated in the destruction of the tea dressed themselves in costume, in particular appropriating dress from the Mohawk Nation. Help us understand what's going on there. I mean, this is a pretty sensitive topic, and it sits right at the intersection of the story of independence and the story of the conquest of Native peoples. What should we make of it when we think about that aspect of the destruction of the tea?
Yeah, and I mean, before my book came out, Phil Deloria's Playing Indian had come out, and in the first chapter, he's already talking about the Tea Party as an early example of white people dressing themselves as Native people, and how offensive that is, but what's going on in white people's minds when they do this. So, using his research and other people's, I tried to tackle this question. I mean, first of all, why a disguise? The easiest answer is, well, so no one would know who they were. But this is a town of only 16,000 people. You knew how your cousin walked or your neighbor carried himself. You know, only less than a quarter of these 16,000 people are adult men. So it's unlikely that their identities were actually a secret. But a disguise is more than just a concealment, right? When you dress up on Halloween, it allows you to step outside your everyday life and rebel against conventional norms. So these disguises were meant to make a statement. They were meant to be scary, sort of, but also because they were obviously disguises, they were supposed to reassure the community that this wasn't the kind of thing that would get out of hand. The disguises were supposed to protect the writer's identity, not because they actually concealed them, but because it sent the message to the wider community not to tattle on them. And also, it was important that the tea destroyers be seen not as part of this respectable gathering of the body of the people at Old South Meeting House, where Bostonians were debating what to do about the tea in this orderly way, but as something separate, again, for which the rest of the town couldn't be blamed and couldn't be held liable. But that doesn't maybe answer all of our questions, right? Why choose an Indian disguise? Were they actually trying to scapegoat actual Mohawks? I don't really think so. But it is true that in the past, Bostonians had often tried to blame African Americans, the Irish, young boys, etc., for riots like the Boston Massacre. Again, it was a way of protecting the upstanding white people of the town for blame for a violent or destructive action. And then we could think about why Mohawks. I mean, New Englanders had grown up, next door to the Mohawks. The Mohawks had a kind of fearsome and respected reputation. So, the Bostonians' adoption of that identity was meant to kind of was meant to say something. And Deloria himself kind of points out, right, that like the colonists envisioned themselves as the sort of new and improved version of Indians who deserved America for themselves. They would be the best of both worlds. They would be purer and freer than the corruption and tyranny of Europe, but they would be more, quote unquote, civilized than actual Native Americans. I mean, it's a really offensive thing for the statement for these disguises to be making. But I think, according to Deloria and others, that's the kind of message that these disguises were meant to convey.
And I think disguises on the night of December 16th were maybe not as important or not as wide as the way the Boston press started to discuss what happened in the following weeks. Because they were to use notion that the Indians had come. They often referred to the Narragansetts, the sachems, as a way to discuss the what had happened, what was going to happen when another ship arrived in March 1774, with deniability. Fairly plausible, but enough deniability that they could take the actions, as Ben was saying, other people were doing this. We cannot be held responsible for this. And that language was all fun. They were continuing to have the disguise. They were continuing to have the sort of misrule that had taken place on that night.
I think it also it's just incredibly powerful symbolically, and it harnessed sort of popular culture, both European popular culture and provincial colonial popular culture, and even provides, you know, some link to the afterlife of what's going to happen in the image of the what becomes the Tea Party, right? What becomes known as the Tea Party. I mean, there were in the sources, there's talk about how some men used soot to darken their complexions. Some men actually used burnt cork, which, if you think about it, is a very powerful symbolically. Is burnt cork was also used in minstrel shows in the 19th century, so a few decades after this, starting a few decades after this. But the notion that when white men put on a different racial identity by darkening their complexion, that they're kind of released from the sort of boundaries of normal, everyday, polite behavior. Now, not to go completely wild, you know, as Joe was pointing out, to just for wanton destruction, but in a performance of violence, in a performance of real destruction of property. And so it heightens the performative aspect of it, and it links to European traditions of crowd action and things like carnivals and the carnivalesque. So other kinds of traditions of using this assumed darkening racial identity, which is, as you were saying, like extremely disrespectful, and you use the word appropriative, but is that in and of itself, that disrespect and that loosening of inhibitions is actually part of European popular culture and colonial popular culture. And it's something that's going to resonate out in not just plausible deniability, but kind of like becomes a focus of the memory of the event, rather than thinking too much about what else was going on or who else was included. It almost takes the place of the specifics of the event, like, oh, this kind of story about the Indianification, for lack of a better word, you know, this sort of disguise being important. Because that's legible to people in the 19th century, because they knew exactly what people dressing up as Indians and darkening their faces with cork looked like, because that was everywhere by the time that the event was being remembered. Not to get ahead, but, you know.
Well, I think it's helpful to position this moment in a longer arc of American history. So those comments are very helpful. I think there's so much more we can unpack about the event itself, but we have about 10 minutes left before we're going to open the floor for questions from the audience tonight. And we have many, many folks in our audience. I want to just invite audience members, if you haven't already taken the opportunity to share a question in the chat box, please do so. And I want to use these last 10 minutes before we open up to Q&A with the audience, just to touch on the aftermath and the longer legacy, perhaps only briefly here, but help us understand what the repercussions of the destruction of the tea were. How did this moment inflect what came after? And Joe, why don't you start us off? How do you see the significance of this event in inflecting the relationship between the colonies and London?
It took about 6 weeks for news of the Tea Party to reach England, but as soon as it did, and it was reported to George III, his reaction was immediate and energetic. And we're looking at an inflection point in our story here, and the story of the creating of the American Revolution. I mean, it's unclear whether Samuel Adams hoped that he would get a reaction from George III, but in fact, George III now commits himself to a series of to parliamentary laws that are called the Intolerable Acts in America, that are going to be the moment at which the British crosses the Rubicon. What has largely been a political and constitutional crisis is about to become a military crisis. And the triggering event is the Boston Tea Party. The debate in Parliament over the Tea Act and over what the legislation passed, if you read the parliamentary debates, it sounds like there are a lot of people in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords that are worried about in doing something radical that might force America towards independence. But that misrepresents the actual debate, because the vote is overwhelming in both branches of Parliament to punish the Americans for this vile act. It's almost George III thinks that they have thrown him into the Boston Harbor, and they need to be taught a lesson. And from his point of view, and from the British ministry's point of view, we've tried to be nice to you. We've tried to treat you fairly. And now you've shown you're a prodigal son. And that we're now going to impose military rule on you in a way that will demonstrate to the rest of the colonies as well that such disobedience will not be tolerated. So again, others can take the story up here, but this is an inflection point. The American Revolution need not have happened up until now. After this, it's going to be very difficult to stop it from happening.
Was the response in Boston to the intolerable acts, was it universal? Was that series of acts universally despised? I mean, right, we talked earlier about no taxation without representation, with the emphasis on representation. The intolerable acts remove representative government from the colony of Massachusetts. Are they hated by all, or are there folks left in Boston who stand up and are still in support of the crown at this point?
There are
anybody who is going to do that is going to be a deep doo-doo. At least if you're a judge and you think you're going to have the 5 judges in Springfield, out in my neck of the woods, are told that they'll be shot, and the level at which people on the ground throughout Massachusetts are committed to standing behind the opposition is well, General Gage is going to tell people back in England that we need another 20,000. As soon as he tells them that, they fire him because they can't accept that. That's the reason I'm saying this is an inflection point.
In the Massachusetts Government Act, which is one of those coercive acts, which changes Massachusetts to self-rule in a lot of ways. That arrives in the middle of August 1774. General Gage starts to implement. By the first week of September 1774, he has lost control of the entire countryside outside of Boston. Because for years, the people in Boston, the leaders have been trying to rile up everybody to say that these are important things. Then once the British government, one Parliament actually elects town meeting out in Deerfield, then the countryside becomes more radical, more militant than the town, and royal authority stops at the Boston from September 1774 on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. In Boston, it's perfectly reasonable to express loyalist sentiment because the British troops are in charge, and so the ball gets picked up by the Massachusetts countryside. And Ray Raphael's books make this point very well.
So, is it fair to say, without the actions of the crowd on the night of December 16th, 1773, the path to independence is going to be different, significantly different, or is not going to happen at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of counterfactually. Something else might have happened if this hadn't. But another thing that happens in addition to the countryside being radicalized is that a lot of other colonies, right, come to support radicals in other colonies, revolutionaries in other colonies. You might even start to call them, come to support Massachusetts and to protest the acts and to protest the government revocation. And it strengthens the ties between colonies. It probably leads more or less directly to the creation of the First Continental Congress. I mean, so there are many ways in which it ripples out way beyond Massachusetts to connect anti-British sentiment and anti-British politics in an even stronger way than had happened since 1765, and is then hurtling towards war as well. But that's not to say something else couldn't have happened, but this is what happened, and it certainly had that effect. Still plenty of loyalists in those places too, but the momentum is greatly increased towards revolutionary activity and networks.
Joe.
Let me just stress the point that's being made here. It's not just that Great Britain makes what is perhaps the biggest blunder in the history of British statecraft, but that their theory was, if we isolate Massachusetts and demonstrate to Massachusetts that they can't behave this way, that nobody in the rest of the colonies is going to support them, because there's no history of common support. A brief meeting for the Stamp Act, but that Americans didn't think of themselves as Americans. They thought themselves as New Englanders, Massachusetts, Virginians, Carolinians, Pennsylvanians. What's rather amazing is the unanimity of the response here. What they've had to bring them together before is membership in the British Empire. And now what they're beginning to see is what they have in common is hostility to the British Empire. And you get, even though we're still far away from any commitment to independence, remember, the war is going to start 15 months before, in fact, the declaration is going to be declared. So that out there, there's still a hope that Great Britain will, or George III will come to his senses. It's John Adams at the time says, we're waiting for a Messiah who will never come. But that what unleashes this is the Tea Party. What is surprising to Britain is the unanimity of the colonial response.
Thank you. So I think all of you have made a wonderful case for the significance of this event, and perhaps given its significance, it's not surprising that there are few moments in American history that are more encrusted in mythology than this particular event. We're not going to unpack all of that tonight. I just want to ask one question before I throw the floor open to our audience, and that is this. Why is it important today for us to understand the actions of these people who did who took this plunge 250 years ago in December of 1773? Why should we pay attention all these years later?
Well, I would say, without getting too political, sometimes when a group of people defies the law on behalf of what they see as a greater principle, we find that to be a really admirable act of civil disobedience. Sometimes when people go outside the law to do something violent and destructive, we see it as really destabilizing and disorderly and a threat to the institutions that we built. And there have been examples of people throughout American and world history who have used the Boston Tea Party as their example, both for causes that we might now see as benevolent and others that we would see as deeply evil.
Gosh, how fair-minded. I couldn't be that fair-minded about it. Thank you. That was good.
Does anybody else have thoughts about this? Why is it important for us to understand these folks and their actions?
I think every country is interested in its origin, and it's better to have an accurate idea of the origin story that you're going to be interested in anyway.
I also think that per both of those, that it's really important and an ongoing part, as Ben said, of the United States' stories that the United States tells itself, with different groups within the United States tell ourselves about why we matter. This is one of those stories that people can turn into heroes and villains, and it's usually seen in one way, but it has been seen in lots of different ways over the 250 years since. And if we don't think about how that process happens. So not only accuracy about the actual destruction of the tea, but accuracy about when and how various groups have mobilized the heroic nature, or the supposedly heroic nature. What is it to be heroic? Why did other events also become heroic seeming events and maybe even overtake the memory of the Tea Party, something like Lexington and Concord, or other events of the revolution, the parts of the founding story? And how do those events relate to each other? If we don't think about how the memories of those events are created and how that also feeds a lot into our national character, then we're also missing something really fundamental that we really need to understand today. How we tell stories about ourselves and about our political commitments really, really matter. And the way we resort to the founding era for legitimacy really matters, regardless of what message you are trying to personally proclaim at that moment. I think it behooves all of us to think very carefully when we hear someone deploying this kind of event as a metaphor. What work is it doing, and how does it relate to what actually happened, and how could it even be twisted? Let's put it that way.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to our entire panel for your heroic efforts tonight to cover such a rich and complex subject. I think there's so much more to unpack here, and I think it will be the work of Revolutionary Spaces and all of our fantastic partners during this commemorative year to try to come back to these themes that you've surfaced for us in this conversation, try to understand them, and try to find the ways to connect them to the issues that we still are grappling with as a nation, as a democracy today. But I do want to make sure that we open the floor for questions. I think we have some great questions from our audience members. So Gina, can you just pop the first question up on the screen for us?
Absolutely. I'm going to pop the first one up right here.
Great. Abigail and Robert Stark ask, does that mean that women would have attended the meeting, such as Abigail Adams? Is there a record of who would have been there? What are our sources, and who could come into a meeting of the body of the people during those weeks in November and the first half of December, and who might have been excluded? Were women allowed to participate, and would they have been in the room?
I don't think, as people have said, that because it was the body of the people didn't really have a set rule the way the town did, where you had to have a certain amount of property in order to participate. On the other hand, society had rules, and I think society had very strong rules against women participate in politics in an outdoor or formal, visible way. So I think it's quite telling that I can't think of any first-person account memory of a woman participating in those meetings. We have a lot of accounts of women participating in tea boycott and deciding not to drink tea, sacrifice not to drink tea, helping relatives with the tea destruction, but not involved in the public debate.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that women were necessarily inside the 5,000, inside the meeting, but just that if we think of it as a porous space, I certainly think it's true that there was no tradition of women being political formally, but that's also mostly true of elite women, and poorer women were certainly in the streets of Boston. And I certainly think it's possible women could have been, on the outskirts of the meeting, outside the building, kind of on that porous edge is what I was talking about. And there are sources talking about women helping their husbands or male relatives get ready to go down to the destruction. So maybe in more private spaces in homes. So not in the meeting, but actually assisting with the destruction in a kind of outside the meeting in a more domestic space, that sort of thing. And they certainly were passing letters and news. And you have Mercy Otis Warren writing about it afterwards. So there's a lot of, I would say there is female political participation, but probably not inside Old South. But I wouldn't exclude it from the realm of possibility that there were some in there somewhere, or outside, kind of on the edge, as I said, or, cleaning up afterwards, for that matter. I don't know how you see, like, when the meeting stopped and started, with the fits and starts, to say there was a zero female presence, I would not stand by that either. Let's put it that way.
Great.
I'd like to hold open the possibility for some women. Remember, in churches, women participated on an equal basis. And we've been told this is not a formal meeting of the government, and therefore, Abigail wasn't there. She was down in Braintree, but she's writing to John at this very time about the embargo and about the way in which women are gathering to protest as women to protest the cost of bread at that time. And so I think that women have a role in some of the larger meetings for the resistance that are not reported, and we shouldn't expect to see reported. But to say they were not there is just not necessarily true.
Great, thank you. Next question. Linda asks, what are the best primary sources to read the actual dialogue that took place during this tea debate? I'd love to read actual quotes, pro and con, among the different classes that participated. Can somebody tell us about the source material that survives from those meetings? Do we have a record of what was said, or do we have to infer from eyewitness accounts?
We have some records because the town clerk, William Hooper, took notes as if it were a town meeting. It was almost as if it were a town of the resolution and the formal document. And those are online from the Massachusetts Historical Society. We also have a very interesting report from a loyalist, an anonymous loyalist, quite possibly a man named Chipman, reporting to the royal government about what was happening in the very end meeting, especially. One thing he talks about, or he wrote about, was he was looking to see who the leaders were and where they were when they left. And all the top leadership in the Boston Whigs were around when the quote-unquote mocks were going to dock, except William Molyneux.
There's Mono again. Ben, you did a lot of research on this period and on this event. What are some of the more interesting sources that you were able to get your hands on?
The one that I always say is the Palfrey papers at Houghton Library at Harvard, because he's a close associate of John Hancock, and he's the one who's writing from New York and Philadelphia, telling them how low the reputation of the Boston Sons of Liberty has sunk. And so that was really my favorite source. But I also dug a lot of places to try and figure out who all the different Tea Party participants were. There was a person in the chat who was really interested in Nicholas Campbell being of Maltese descent. I did find that it was mentioned in his obituary. And so yeah, there's lots of places, especially with the digital access. There's all sorts of stuff you can get your hands on.
Right.
This is one of the reasons I never attempted to write about Sam Adams, because most of the important things he did were thrown into the fireplace and were never recorded. And I am certain there were meetings of the Sons of Liberty that preceded this, in which strategy was discussed. And again, that we'll never know what was said. And Samuel Adams didn't leave fingerprints. And John, in his latter years, would write to Jefferson and say that Sam Adams is the man, and he didn't call him Sam, he called him Samuel. He hadn't gotten to the beer yet, but that he just remembered Samuel Adams standing in front of a fireplace, throwing the papers from a recent meeting into the fireplace. This is what we'll never know.
Right. Historians everywhere pulling our hair out.
Yeah. It's at any rate.
Great. Okay. Next question from Danny. What do we know of Southern colonies' response to the Tea Party? So how did news travel within the colonies, and in particular, how was it received in those Southern colonies?
I remember George Washington being initially a little alarmed, like maybe this is too far. And then eventually Washington kind of comes around and say, along with Jefferson, and kind of says, yeah, okay, we kind of had to object to this act on a constitutional basis. But originally, like, Americans are not necessarily all rushing to embrace the Tea Party as a good idea. It's only once they see the British response that they're like, oh, wow, yeah, now we really need to stand together.
I think that once they come together in the First Continental Congress, there's strong worry present. There's worry in the other colonies that they're being drawn into conflict over the abyss towards independence by these crazy people in Massachusetts. And both Sam Adams and John Adams therefore say we have to keep quiet during this time. We need the leadership to come from others. And there has to be a united front. That's what they agreed. But these are prudent revolutionaries, somewhat of a contradiction in terms. And at this stage of the game, Boston and Massachusetts looks like where the crazies are, and they don't want to. On the one hand, they want to support them. On the other hand, they don't want this to move too fast, too far.
So the thing that holds the nascent union together is that they can agree that they're crazy in Boston and in Massachusetts. Perhaps there's something there that we should study. All right. Richard asks, is it true that the Tea Act maintained the modest colonial tax, but in order to lower the commodity price, merchants who exported tea to the colonies were refunded the original British customs duty?
Yeah, that is true. You're referring to a kind of obscure little thing in the legislation called the drawback. That the revenue would be drawn back. It's sort of too complicated to really get into, but that's basically right.
Great. And the final question here from Abigail and Robert Stark, again, the smaller cities that also had their own tea parties, if Boston was being made an example of, does that mean that they went unpunished? There were other examples of destruction of the tea in other places. Was it just Boston that was singled out? And if so, why?
I mean, by that time, right, like the singling out is, the war's about to start and the Americans are busy ordering gunpowder and arms from European countries. So, I mean, sure, and New York, by the way, has its Tea Party. That's not a smaller city than Boston. So, I mean, yeah, as the protest gets widespread, it's harder and harder for the British government to do anything about it. And this is why the king basically puts the colonies out of his protection and says, all right, it's a rebellion now. And that's when they have to do something more serious.
I think also Boston had, and Massachusetts in general, had maintained more control over its own governance by the point of 1773 than some of the other colonies had. They had already been clamped down upon in large ways and had the structure of their governments and courts. That had been an issue, with the burning of the Gaspé, for instance, in Rhode Island, that the British had tried to had controlled the trial of the people who had destroyed the property and tried to really control it, or maybe even send them to England for trial. And so it was more a fact that Boston had held out and Massachusetts had held out longer with more autonomy and more local control. And so that also played a role in that the clampdown comes on Boston because they had already tried to clamp down in other places, not totally successfully, as evidenced by these other tea parties or burning of tea or destruction of tea. But there was more to revoke in Massachusetts because local control had already been less allowed in places like New York or South Carolina or Virginia even. So.
Fantastic. Well, Sarah, you have the last word tonight. And before I turn it over to Gina to take us out this evening, I just want to say again how grateful I am to all of our panelists for sharing their expertise and their insights with us. It's been a really rich and lively discussion. So thank you for kicking off our 250th anniversary commemoration of the Boston Tea Party tonight.